Hello, brethren. It's good to be with you. Wanted to take this time and talk about an issue that's been being brought up a lot, and that is the line that Christians are to walk between civil obedience and godly obedience. To begin, I'd like you to consider this symbol. It's called the yin and yang symbol. And the black represents chaos. The white represents order. And you'll notice that there's a white dot in the middle of the black because the ultimate chaos, where chaos is everything, that is a form of order. And there's a black dot in the white because the ultimate in order, where everything is completely controlled, is chaotic. And what this symbol represents is the struggle between the forces of chaos and the forces of order. And you may have heard of Taoism. It's called the way. The way that people are to walk is that fine line. I'm not going to be able to do it. Whoa. That fine line between the black and the white. Oh, of course. Of course. You see that sinewy line that curves around. That's how you're supposed to walk. The fine line between chaos and order. Well, Christians too have a way that they are to walk. That is, to live their lives. We are not of this world, but we are in this world. So right there's going to be a dichotomy. There's going to be a struggle because the world is constantly going to be wanting to pull us to be of the world. We have to constantly resist that. And yet we're not supposed to go and separate ourselves and go live in a monastery somewhere. We're supposed to live in the world that we might influence the world. And so there is a way that must be navigated between the two extremes. At the East Tennessee School of Preaching and Missions, where I attended, they prided themselves on balance, biblical balance, and that's that idea of the way. Well, what about the present distress that we find ourselves in? We have a governing authority telling us, he's not telling us that we can't assemble, he is recommending highly that we not, and there has been discussions about, or there have been news stories of people that have tried to assemble and that law enforcement has dealt with them. But at the same time, we know that they then went to court and lost that case. So, but basically, there are people saying, no, wait a minute, we're being told not to worship, and that is an infringement of our First Amendment rights. And as Christians, we should violate it because we got to stand up for God. But at the same time, doesn't the Bible teach us that we are to obey the civil authority? So that's what I want to talk about briefly. We're going to begin by talking about what the Bible says about the Christian's relationship with the civil authority. So if you go ahead and turn to Romans, the 13th chapter, I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. Again, I have allergies. I'm great. Everything's good. Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will have praise for the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. What did he say? He said God is ultimately what authority is all about. He is the ultimate authority. And our civil authorities are simply mimicking his authority. Now, that doesn't mean that every person that's in a position of authority, God wanted him, or that is God's choice, if he could have anyone, to be in that place of authority. That's not the case. The concept of authority, however, is from God and is God's. And these governing authorities in the civil secular world are supposed to be those who reward good and punish evil, just like God does. That's what the civil authorities are supposed to do. So Christians are to have a healthy respect and an obedience to the civil authority, just like we do to God's authority. Well, what about if a civil authority is evil? Well, it depends what the law is that you would fight against. If the civil authority spoke against religion, we'll talk about that in a minute. We can't go there yet. But if the civil authority said that on highways you have to drive 55 miles an hour maximum, you can't drive over 55, then we have to submit. Because ultimately, well, let's add to this before I start waxing that elephant. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. The reason that Christians are to be submissive to every ordinance of the civil authority is for God's sake. As Paul said in the Romans, because God is the epitome of what authority is. All authority finds itself, true authority finds itself, its root in God. But then he said for conscience sake as well. Remember, Paul said that it wasn't just for wrath. We don't obey civil authorities just because we're afraid. We also obey because we have a good conscience, and our job is to be obedient. Notice he said every ordinance. So that silly speed limit that's way below what it should be, as one of God's people, we are to obey it for the Lord's sake, to avoid wrath and for a good conscience. We submit ourselves, even though it's foolish. We don't have to agree with the law. Well, what about if this law directly opposes God's law? If a law said we had to pay 50% of all of our income in taxes, would that be acceptable? Should we obey that? Well, I can find nothing in God's law that speaks against that, so yes, we should obey. I like to always bring this up because it kind of steps on people's toes, but the foundation of the American Revolution, it wasn't religious freedom. It was taxation without representation, right? So should we have rebelled? As Christians, think about that. And let's talk about it sometime. It's fun. But let's talk about the exception to this rule of obedience to every ordinance of our civil authority. Turn to Acts chapter 5. Well, we'll begin back in Acts chapter 4. Peter and John are preaching the gospel message. The religious leaders, members of the Sanhedrin, are not a big fan of that, obviously. They have arrested Peter and John and told them to stop preaching the gospel message. Peter and John answers in verse 19 of Acts chapter 4. But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. So, Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20, the apostles were given the Great Commission by the authority of Jesus, who has all authority in heaven and on earth, to go and preach the gospel everywhere. Here's a civil authority saying, don't preach the gospel anywhere. Peter says, we should obey God, not you. If you don't think so, you do what you got to do. But as for us, we're going to listen to God more than we're going to listen to you. Kind of like what Joshua said about, you want to worship other gods? You go ahead. But as for me and my family, we'll worship the Lord. Turn over to chapter 5 of Acts. They've been arrested again. And look at verse 29. They were told again, strictly, don't preach the gospel. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. When civil authority laws directly oppose God's laws, God's people must follow God's law. Okay? If there is no, like we talked about, speed limits. Okay? Oh, they're going to make the speed limit in this area 5 miles an hour. Well, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. There's nothing biblically wrong with that. Comply. Why? For the Lord's sake. To avoid wrath. For a clean conscience. But if there is a direct opposition to the Word of God, then we as God's people must stand against it. If we were all commanded to abort children, that's murder, we would have to refuse. We would have to disobey, even if it meant facing the wrath, right? Even if it meant imprisonment and being killed. And we know that's what happened to most of the apostles. So what about this current situation? Our governor has said that we are to stay at home until at least June 1st, that we are not to assemble together. But when you look more into his rule, it is not a law of the land. It is an emergency order. He has not told Christians specifically and alone that only they cannot assemble. He said everybody can assemble. So secular organizations, the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, they're not supposed to be meeting either. So it's not something that's been directly against God. And as Christians, we're able to worship even if we can't assemble all together, the church all in one place. Every Sunday, the church meets in my house, and it's just my family. I assume every Sunday the church meets in your house or with family, and you assemble together. Now, this is a temporary situation as we try to deal with a situation that is unique, at least in the way that it's being dealt with and presented. So the advice that's being given is don't assemble in large numbers because this virus is extremely catchy. You can be spreading it and not even know that you have it. And those who are in special groups, the aged, those who have immune deficiencies, diabetes and a couple other things, make them especially susceptible to this virus and actually dying from it. How do we protect them? Well, the governor is saying, stay away from each other. Stay home. He's not calling out just Christians. It's to everybody. And we can still worship. We can still even, thank goodness, because of the technology that we have available, we can even get together in a sense virtually by way of the interweb. So it doesn't seem to be a direct negation. I don't know why I'm struggling with that word. It's not in direct opposition to the will of God. What our governor is saying, please, just for a bit of time, I think it's smart for us not to assemble in large numbers because of the weakest among us. Now, our elders have ultimately the decision on whether we will assemble all together or not. And they have looked at the information, and they have made the determination that at least for the next couple of weeks, and we're a good ways into the first week, we're going to comply. And it doesn't make sense to assemble because, again, there are a lot of things we still don't know. But every day we get new information. Every day we learn more about this virus and who are really at risk with this virus. There are more effective treatments coming in every day, so that maybe at the end of this 2 weeks that our elders have decided upon, maybe they will say, I think it's time for some to come back together. We'll have family groups separate themselves 6 feet away. We've got a pretty large auditorium. And those people who are not comfortable or maybe in that group that is at risk, maybe they shouldn't come, or if they do come, for sure, wear masks and things like that. We know that's going to happen. But to see this as a direct attack against religions, there may be people trying to add that to the hopper, but that's really not what's going on. Because like we said, if we wanted to gather and get 6 feet apart, as our mayor said the other day, there's no enforcement of this. But does it make sense for us to, is this an expression, is this the battlefield we want to die upon? Well, yes, we could have met and never stopped meeting, and some of our older and those who are at risk could have gotten sick and died, and could we sit there at their funerals in smug satisfaction going, well, I didn't let my rights get trampled upon? Well, is that smart? Remember that line between chaos and order? Well, we have to walk that line. What's wise? This isn't a direct attack against the church. It's not a direct attack against religion. It is affecting religion and the church. But our church leaders are not feeling compelled. They're trying to do what's wise. They're supposed to look out for the flock. And that's what they're doing. So I don't think there's any really big issue here, and I think we just have to be patient. And we're going to learn a lot from this. And if anything, it is my prayer that you are learning how special and precious the assembly of God's people is. That it is wonderful and a blessing from God not to be taken for granted. I love you, and I will talk to you later. If you have any questions, feel free, or you just want to talk, you want to blow steam, feel free to contact me, and let's have that conversation. Love you. Bye-bye.